Southern Minnesota, August 18, 1862. As the fast-moving current of the Minnesota River threatens to sweep him and his men downstream, Captain John Marsh of the 15th Minnesota Infantry does his best to direct his men across the river to the opposite bank. As the men struggle against the current, many of them repeatedly losing their footing, the air around them is filled with bullets, arrows, and war cries from the Dakota warriors that pursue them. Many of these soldiers are young men, some still teenagers, and they are rightly terrified at the hellacious attack that now surrounds them. Many of their fellow soldiers have been cut down already, and many more wounded lie strewn about the riverbank, desperately pleading with their comrades not to leave them. These unfortunate men are soon cut down where they lay, as Dakota warriors swarm the area, dozens of them seemingly appearing out of nowhere. To the American soldiers, it seems that hell itself has been unleashed upon them. And to Captain Marsh, it seems that he has led his men into the inferno. Only hours earlier, at around 10 in the morning, he and his men had been on the grounds of Fort Ridgely, when word had reached them that there had been an attack on the nearby headquarters of the Lower Sioux Agency. J.C. Dickinson, the manager of the agency's boarding house, had arrived at the fort after a harrowing trip from the agency in a buckboard wagon, carrying himself and his young family. He had reported to Captain Marsh that the Dakota, a subculture belonging to the mighty Sioux tribe, were laying waste to the agency and to the surrounding settlements, already having killed several soldiers and settlers. Soon after Dickinson and his family hurry into the fort, more settlers appear outside of the gate, begging for shelter and protection from the attacks. By 10:30 a.m., Captain Marsh had assembled a force of 47 men and marched out of the relative safety of the fort towards the site of the agency. As they proceeded towards the site of the attacks, they were met by dozens of frightened and wounded settlers, all of them fleeing towards Fort Ridgely, and all of them warning the soldiers not to proceed any further, as an ambush would likely already be set for them at the Redwood Ferry crossing. However, seeing the utter devastation being wrought upon his fellow Americans, Captain Marsh had been insistent that he and his men were adequately prepared to meet any threat. Thus, undeterred, he had ushered his men forward through the untold destruction that had been left in the wake of the recent Dakota raiding. As they approached the site of the ferry, the only available means of safely crossing the turbulent river, they encountered several burned-out homesteads of local settlers. With every passing mile, his men had, understandably, become increasingly unsure of their captain's insistence on moving towards what looked like a virtually unavoidable ambush. But still, Marsh had remained unmoved and ordered his men onward. As they neared the ferry, a number of wagons from Fort Ridgely had managed to catch up to them, and Marsh, himself mounted on a mule, had ordered his foot-bound men into the wagons in order to reach the ferry sooner. This seemed to many of his men as though this was simply a means of hastening their own demise. But with nothing in the way of recourse, they had dutifully loaded into the wagons and ridden off towards the river. Unfortunately, the premonitions of the soldiers would soon be proven correct. About a mile away from the river, they had been hurriedly unloaded by the increasingly unnerved wagon teamsters, who themselves seemed rapidly unsure of Captain Marsh's logic, as an attack from the Dakota seemed more and more imminent, especially at the site of the river crossing. However, after dismounting the wagons, Marsh had simply ordered his men to again assemble and continue their march forward. His intention had been for his men to board the ferry, then to cross and proceed onwards towards the site of the Lower Sioux Agency in order to quell the uprising. But Marsh's insistence that there would be no contact with the Dakota warriors until they neared the agency had proven to be a grave miscalculation. After being dropped off by the wagons, he and his men had proceeded across a small creek and, after a brief rest, had proceeded on towards the site of the Redwood Ferry. In a grisly harbinger of the events to come, they found the body of the operator of the ferry, headless and mutilated, only a few dozen yards from the small building which served as the ferry's headquarters. For any young soldier stationed in Minnesota, the thought of a roving band of Dakota warriors is, perhaps, the most terrifying thing they can imagine. The Dakota are the easternmost of the three divisions of the Sioux people, who inhabit Minnesota, northern Iowa, and eastern South Dakota. Unlike their western counterparts in the Nakota and the Lakota, the Dakota have adopted a partially agricultural lifestyle. Though they still depend heavily on hunting and gathering, they also farm crops of what is known to tribes throughout North America as the Three Sisters, in beans, squash, and corn. The Dakotas' dependence on their crops is, in fact, a driving factor behind today's attacks. In the Mendota Treaty of 1851, the Dakota had agreed to implement more anglicized farming practices employing tools, techniques, and training provided by the Lower Sioux Agency. But in recent years, the availability of seeds, tools, and cash for crops has slowed considerably. This resulted in the Dakota relying even more heavily on hunting. But they also found hunting to be made nearly impossible by the terms of the 1851 treaty, which relegated them to hunting grounds consisting of only a small strip stretching along the Minnesota River. Unable to yield sufficient crops or to hunt for their own meat, the tribe had been left almost solely reliant upon rationing from the U.S. government. And in the early 1860s, especially after the advent of the Civil War, the dispensation of rations was often drastically delayed or canceled outright. This storm of violence now being wrought upon the soldiers and settlers of southern Minnesota is a direct result of the Dakota's recent treatment. The Dakota have been greatly angered, as had been evidenced to Captain Marsh's men with the gory sight of the ferry pilot's corpse. And as the soldiers had walked past, many of them had worried if they would soon meet a similar fate. And in the end, many would be correct. As they arrived at the Minnesota River, an eerie stillness seemed to linger in the air. The banks of the river were covered in thick weeds and brush, making it nearly impossible to spot any movements from either shore. To add to the unsettling nature of the situation, the ferry boat itself sits untouched in the water, tethered to its usual location. This, to be sure, is a nearly inexplicable oversight considering the Dakota have lain waste to so many homesteads and settlers already. Why, many of the soldiers wonder, would their means of transport across the river be left unbothered? However, Captain Marsh continues to insist that this location holds no discernible danger, and thus he orders his men to take their positions as the ferry is made ready to transport them to the opposite bank. But suddenly, before the soldiers are able to load into the ferry, a Dakota chief appears on the western bank of the river. By many accounts, this is said to be the much respected and well-liked chief named White Dog. His body is painted red, and he holds the reins of his horse in one hand and a gleaming tomahawk in the other. However, despite his fearsome appearance, the chief signals to Marsh's interpreter, a local guide named Peter Quinn, with overtures of peace. From across the river, Quinn asks the chief why he, a man who is relatively well known to all of them as a peaceable individual, appears to be dressed and ready for war. The chief insists that he has brought his tomahawk merely to smoke with the army's representatives and to parley for an end to the violence. It is not wholly uncommon for the Plains tribes to hollow out the handle of a tomahawk in order to use it to smoke their tobacco. And while Captain Marsh now feels a growing, unshakable suspicion, he and Quinn agree to the chief's terms and begin to move towards the ferry. But before they can even reach the crossing site, one of Marsh's men cries out that he has spotted a Dakota warrior hidden in the reeds and brush along the riverbank on this side of the river. In a matter of only a few seconds, another cry goes out, and then another. Now, dozens of Dakota warriors can be seen swarming the banks, moving directly towards the soldiers. It seems that the negotiations for peace had only been a ruse in order to buy the warriors more time to get into position. And now, it was far too late for the soldiers to escape. In only a matter of moments, it had seemed to Captain Marsh and his men that the world had exploded into a fury of war cries and gunshots. Arrows began to whiz in amongst them, sending several soldiers crumbling to the ground, killed or grievously wounded. Marsh orders his men to return fire and make ready to retreat back to the road which they had come in on. But, to their horror, their retreat was also cut off by the horde of Dakota warriors. Now, they are trapped. Marsh then ordered his men to make a break for the cover of a small thicket behind them, the only immediate area that is not flush with Dakota warriors. As more and more of their comrades fall dead and wounded around them, the soldiers follow Marsh to the thicket and then down the bank of the river. The thicket was dense enough that the Dakota attack had been unable to reach them, but it would only be a matter of minutes, at best, before the thicket ended and the Dakota would be upon them again. Captain Marsh had surveyed their rapidly devolving situation and seen only one terrifying option as their only hope for retreat. In order to make their escape and attempt to make it back to Fort Ridgely, they would have to cross the fast-moving river. And thus, Captain Marsh, a confident swimmer, had led his men into the water, where they now fight to somehow keep their heads above water and simultaneously avoid the Dakota's constant fire. Marsh exhorts them to struggle on to the opposite bank, while himself dodging projectiles that slam into the water all around him. But suddenly, his head disappears under the water. Then he reappears, apparently in great distress. The swift current has swept him under. Two of his men move to save him, attempting to grab him without being swept away themselves. But within seconds, he disappears for a second time. His men will never see him again. But despite the loss of their captain, the men remaining in the river, surrounded by Dakota warriors intent on killing them, must now struggle on to cross. In what is undoubtedly a horrifying scene for all of them, several more of their party, one by one, are swept away by the river's current, all of them never to be seen again. Of the 47 soldiers that had marched out of the fort on this morning, now only 23 remain as they throw themselves onto the south bank of the river and make desperate scrambles into the nearby woods. In fact, the chaos has separated the men into two groups who have lost contact with each other. Every man among them is now fervently aware that they have only escaped for the moment, and that they are now all unarmed and stranded in the middle of enemy territory. Now, they must make their way back to Fort Ridgely, or they will all surely perish. In the face of this, it is 19-year-old Sergeant John F. Bishop who takes the lead of his group of survivors totaling 15 men, 5 of whom are grievously wounded. With the ever-present threat of another Dakota ambush, they cautiously make their way back to the fort, only arriving well after nightfall. The next day, the second group of 8 infantrymen would make their way into the fort, with several severely wounded soldiers among them. The 24th survivor, the badly wounded William Sutherland, would only make his way to the fort on August 20th after a harrowing 2-day trek alone through the wilderness. The fort itself is now bereft of a large number of its officers and soldiers whom they had depended on for defense. Now, it seems to many within the fort that all they can do is sit and wait for the next Dakota attack. And the next attack will certainly come. The events of August 18th will be known to history as the Battle of Redwood Ferry, and it would be the first battle in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. This war, often overlooked in the shadow of the simultaneously occurring Civil War, will bear witness to some of the most brutal fighting ever seen on the American frontier. Over the course of the next 5 weeks, over 500 soldiers and settlers would be killed, along with hundreds of Dakota. In fact, by the time the last of the survivors had reached Fort Ridgely, the next attack was already taking place as another contingent of warriors attacked the nearby town of New Ulm, Minnesota. Though the settlers and soldiers present would drive them off after a hard fight, the Dakota would return again only days later to wreak havoc on the small settlement. On August 20th, the same day that William Sutherland had crawled through the gates after his harrowing one-man escape, the Dakota would attack Fort Ridgely itself. Though the small Dakota force would be driven off, only 2 days after this, they would return again with a far larger and far more organized force. The raiding would not stop until mid-September of 1862, when the vast majority of the Dakota warriors were either driven west to the lands of their Sioux cousins or forced to surrender to the army. Over 300 of these warriors would be tried by hastily assembled military tribunals and summarily sentenced to death by hanging. These sentences would be reviewed by then-sitting President Abraham Lincoln, and while Lincoln would pardon the vast majority of those condemned, he would sign off on the execution of 39 Dakota warriors. In the end, one additional warrior would be pardoned, leaving 38 to face the gallows on December 26, 1862. These hangings, the largest mass execution in American history, would be not only the final act of violence in the U.S.-Dakota War, but a turning point for Native tribes on the Northern Plains. The government's hopes of creating a large-scale spectacle that would discourage regional uprisings once and for all would ultimately backfire significantly. The act would only redouble the resolve of the Dakota and other tribes to fight on until the bitter end. After December 26, 1862, their willingness to cooperate or negotiate with the United States government would be greatly diminished for decades to come. In many respects, the many battles of the short but unimaginably intense U.S.-Dakota War would spell the beginning of the end for the tribes of the Sioux Nation, though the war with the U.S. Army would continue for many years to come. But the many tales of the unbelievably brutal, violent battles of the U.S.-Dakota War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southeastern Idaho, January 29, 1863. As the early morning sun peeks over the mountaintops, Chief Sagwitch of the Shoshone tribe shakes off the cold of the night and takes in the tranquil beauty of the dawn landscape around him. His people have come here, as they have for generations, to hunker down in their lodges to endure another freezing Utah winter. He is proud to be Shoshone and grateful for the lands of his people, but suddenly the chief spots a curious sight on the horizon, a cloud of fog slowly rising over the hilltops. At first, he believes this to be simply the morning frost evaporating under the new day's sun, but after watching for several minutes, he notices that the cloud has moved, and it is approaching the site of his village. This, he is certain, likely signals only one thing: the approach of a large group of men and horses, moving straight towards he and his people's winter sanctuary. Now, he sends up a cry of alarm, rousing his warriors and calling a meeting in his lodge. The men, knowing time is scarce, hurriedly discuss their next moves. They all know the likely cause of the soldiers' impending arrival. In the few years prior, their interaction with the U.S. Army has been relatively limited, as the majority of American fighting men are engaged in the Civil War, taking place mostly east of the Mississippi River. But on January 5, 1863, only a few weeks prior to this morning, a group of 10 miners, traveling west on the Montana Trail, had been murdered, allegedly by a group of Shoshone raiders. On January 6th, another group of miners headed south to Salt Lake City had been accosted and robbed, again, allegedly, by a group of unidentified Shoshone warriors. That same day, in an argument with another group of more unidentified natives, a local Idaho rancher named John H. Smith was shot down by the natives whom he accused of stealing his cattle. A Salt Lake City judge had issued a warrant for the arrest of the Shoshone warriors alleged to have been involved. Orders for enforcing the warrant had fallen to U.S. Army Colonel Patrick E. Connor. Connor is a commander of roughly 300 infantrymen and cavalry from the 3rd Regiment California Volunteer Infantry, who are stationed in Salt Lake City during the Civil War. His men are largely frustrated regulars who are in large part resentful of their post on the frontier, one that all but nullifies their chances of battlefield glory during their nation's greatest conflict. But, charged with this less than desirable duty, they had begun their march northward, set on apprehending the guilty Shoshone, or, for that matter, any Shoshone. Knowing that retributive actions were soon coming their way, roughly 50 Shoshone warriors had fled Sagwich's village only a few days prior, but most had seen fit to stay with their trusted chief. Now, surrounded by his warriors in his lodge, he advises them to proceed with caution in their interactions with the approaching soldiers. Bloodshed, he reminds them, is not a foregone conclusion, and their primary concern must be the safety of their village and their families. He is also well aware that the Shoshone do not possess the firepower to compete with any U.S. Army detachment. Most of the warriors have in their possession rifles that have been captured in battles, garnered in trade, or are what amounts to antiques, passed down through several generations. But they are not wholly defenseless. They have selected a location for their village that is only accessible through one path leading in and out. They have also erected fences of woven willow branches in order to obscure an outsider's view into the village, and they have dug firing pits behind the fence. And, although the Shoshone do not know it, the soldiers now approaching their village, though armed with superior weapons and training, are themselves in a highly compromised position from both the length of their journey and the elements. In the previous few days, as they traveled north through Cache Valley, the weather had been unseasonably cold, with some local accounts holding that temperatures reached as low as -20 Fahrenheit. Colonel Connor had intended for he and his men to leave their camp and move out for their final approach to the Shoshone village at about 1 a.m. in the morning. However, the inclement weather and their inability to procure a local guide had delayed their departure until 3 a.m., costing them valuable time. When the company finally did ride out of their camp, roughly 1/3 of their men had to be left behind, as they had been rendered combat ineffective due to frostbite or some other ailment brought on by the extreme cold. Their field artillery, comprised of the infamous mountain howitzers, had been stalled by the heavy snow, depriving them of another critical element in their attack plan. However, despite these difficulties, the U.S. Army force still far outmatches the Shoshone village, and they intend to carry out their orders to the letter. Now, as Chief Sagwich and his warriors exit his lodge, they are greeted with the unsettling sight of several dozen of their fellow Shoshone men, women, and children alike, milling about in nervous curiosity as they spot the cavalry breaching the hill, the large cloud of vapor still overhanging their position. Within what seems like mere seconds, the soldiers have formed into a battle line, and, mere seconds later, the air is filled with the roar of U.S. Army rifles, as Shoshone throughout the village begin to fall, dead and dying. In an instant, the entire village is thrown into chaos. Any pretense of negotiation has vanished, and now it seems apparent to all within the village that they are easy targets to the cavalry, and that there will be no reprieve from this attack. Seeing the impact of their initial volley, Connor orders his men to make a head-on charge into the village. The soldiers spur their mounts forward, careening down the hill towards the village, their weapons held aloft, and screaming all manner of battle cries. But this initial charge is driven back, with the Shoshone warriors managing to mount a stiff defense as their women and children flee towards the Bear River. Several of the cavalrymen are killed in this first attack, and eventually the line is forced to retreat back to the top of the hill. Here, Connor now divides his forces, ordering his infantry to stay atop the hill to block any Shoshone escape, as the cavalry split into two forces and set out to flank the Shoshone on both sides. From their firing pits behind their ad hoc willow branch wall, the Shoshone are again able to mount a notable defense of their position. But after roughly 2 hours of fending off flanking maneuvers from the cavalry and direct fire from the infantry, they have found themselves running low on ammunition. Some accounts, though not fully verified, hold that several of the warriors even attempt to melt and pour lead bullets during the course of the battle. With the rate of Shoshone fire drastically decreasing, Connor now senses that this is his moment to strike. A charge into the village is ordered, and now a vicious fight unfolds, as warriors seek to defend their families with any weapon they can find. Lead bullets again pour into the village like lethal drops of rain, indiscriminately cutting down men, women, and children alike. As many of the Shoshone make a desperate flight towards the river and attempt to ford its icy waters, most are shot down on its banks. As chaos ensues on the banks of the river, soldiers and warriors alike engage in vicious hand-to-hand combat. By mid-morning, the entire affair is finished. Surveying the damage done during the battle, Connor reports 224 Shoshone killed, with roughly 160 women and children captured. His men set fire to the 70 lodges that make up the village, as well as to the stockpiles of food they have collected for the winter. 170 Shoshone horses are also captured. But this victory has come at a far greater cost than Connor could have first anticipated. Also strewn about the battlefield are the lifeless bodies of 14 American soldiers. 49 more soldiers are wounded, 7 of them mortally. With their prisoners in tow, the soldiers now begin their trek back to their encampment near Franklin, Utah. As they near the settlement, several of the soldiers take the wounded and dying soldiers into their homes in attempts to care for them. At the local church house, townsfolk bring in piles of blankets for the soldiers in an effort to make theirs and their prisoners' stay at least slightly more bearable in the midst of the biting winter cold. The next day, Connor will enlist the service of several dog sled drivers in order to transport his more seriously wounded men to Salt Lake City to receive more comprehensive medical care. Meanwhile, back at Bear River, Chief Sagwitch, who has actually managed to survive the attack, though he has been shot twice in the hand, now attempts to gather all the surviving Shoshone so that they may flee the site of the battle. He and many others are barely clinging to life, having hidden in the icy river until the soldiers had left. Many are on the verge of hypothermia. Many others had faked being dead, lying still and feigning lifelessness until Connor and his men were out of sight. Sagwitch's son, a young man named Bishop Timimbo, had been shot several times, but somehow managed to survive. Now, Sagwitch, his son, and the other survivors make their way hurriedly to the site of a nearby hot springs in order to warm themselves and soothe their injuries. They soon build a fire, doing their best to stay warm, but worrying all the while about the return of another army detachment. This battle, one that will be known to history as the Bear River Massacre, will go down in history as the single deadliest attack on Native peoples at the hands of the U.S. government. While there is notable disparity in the official accounts of Connor and that of the Shoshone, general estimates hold that between 250 and 350 Shoshone perished that day. For years afterwards, local farmers who came into the area would report the ground too littered with bones to effectively plow. Though what would come to be known to history as the Indian Wars would continue for many decades to come, with seminal battles like the Fetterman Massacre, the Battle of the Rosebud, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as well as multiple other massacres like those at Sand Creek and Wounded Knee still years in the future. The events of the Bear River Massacre would go unsurpassed in their sheer brutality. But while there are countless battles in the war that spanned generations between the native tribes of North America and the United States Army, for tonight, those are other stories for other times. Northern California, May 6, 1850. Just before sunrise, a village of roughly 200 Pomo native men, women, and children lie peacefully sleeping on a small island near the southeastern shore of Clear Lake. As they slumber, a contingent of U.S. Army soldiers, under the command of Captain Nathaniel Lyon, slowly take up positions surrounding the village. Then, just as the first rays of sunlight begin to scatter on the lake's cool waters and the first Pomo villagers begin to stir, the air is suddenly filled with explosions and gunfire as the soldiers fire upon them with their rifles, and artillerymen on the far shore pour an initial volley from their cannons into the island. In an instant, the small village is thrown into abject chaos as the screams of women and children fill the air and the few warriors present arm themselves. But their resistance is to little avail, as the bullets and artillery continue to pour into the small, concentrated area of the island. All around the village, the Pomo begin to fall dead, dying, and wounded. Many of them attempt to flee into the water, making a bid for the nearby shoreline. Most, however, are cut down in the muddy shallows. In but a few moments, a scene of complete and utter carnage has engulfed the native village, and it seems that there will be no end in sight as the gunsmoke continues to fill the air and volley after volley from the Army's weapons continues to blanket the island with deadly effective fire. Soon, the waters around the island are stained red with blood, and still, the firing continues. But this attack, however brutal, is not by any means random, and the Pomo, though certainly caught off guard by the timing and ferocity of the Army's onslaught, are fully aware of why it is happening. In the year prior to this, several Pomo warriors had allegedly been involved in the murders of two prominent local ranchers, Andrew Kelsey and Charles Stone, whose mutilated bodies had been discovered on their expansive rancherias. Word has spread like wildfire amongst the surrounding settlements and ranches, sending many fleeing south towards the northern reaches of the San Francisco Bay. When word had reached the U.S. Army's 1st Dragoons headquartered in Sonoma under the command of Captain Nathaniel Lyon, the prevailing sentiment amongst the men at the fort was that revenge must be exacted upon the murderers. In the early months of 1850, several reconnaissance and intelligence-gathering missions had been sent into the Clear Lake area under the auspices of trying to root out the specific warriors suspected in the double murders. However, in actuality, the bulk of their efforts had centered around locating the Pomo village and planning this morning's attack. To Captain Lyon, the killing of two of the area's most prominent citizens is a crime that all of the Pomo must pay for. But the killings of Kelsey and Stone were by no means random, senseless violence. They were, in fact, acts of retribution carried out by the Pomo in response to years of abuse and subjugation. In fact, the Pomo, who have inhabited this land for centuries, have endured decades of abuse at the hands of the Spanish, the Mexicans, and then the Americans, by way of what amounted to a de facto slavery system in which they were forced into labor without pay. This system had intensified with the institution of California's mission system, but had truly reached its zenith with the advent of the 1849 gold rush, which saw an influx of ranchers such as Kelsey and Stone into the area. While native experiences with the missions and with local ranch bosses did in fact vary wildly, Kelsey and Stone had amounted to some of the most belligerent and abusive employers in the area. They had repeatedly forced the Pomo into unpaid labor and physically assaulted not only their men, but their women as well. After multiple instances of this, the Pomo had seen fit to wreak justice on their own terms. Though no one knows for certain what transpired, several different accounts have spread like wildfire through the area. Most versions hold that the ranchers had whipped and then mortally shot a young Pomo man who had been working for them as a laborer. Some accounts hold that this was in retaliation for theft, and others simply a cruel response to the Pomo's repeated request for more foodstuffs as payment for his work. Most accounts of the killing of Kelsey and Stone hold that the Pomo had rushed the ranchers' sleeping quarters in the dark of the pre-dawn. Kelsey had fled the quarters, but was quickly chased down and dispatched with multiple blows to his head with a large rock. Stone was reportedly cornered within the quarters and viciously whipped before being dispatched as well with his own large knife. Accounts differ on whether the bodies were hidden under cowhides or dumped in the tules of Clear Lake, but in either case, they were soon discovered by neighboring ranchers, and the cry for vengeance against the Pomo soon resounded about the area. Reports of, quote, hostile Indians having killed the two well-known ranchers spread like wildfire, causing a panic throughout Lake, Napa, and Sonoma counties. Panicked locals soon reported the incident to the U.S. Army officials at the Benicia Arsenal, an Army ordnance hub located on the north side of Carquinez Strait, northeast of the San Francisco Bay. Here, the reports reached the desk of Captain Nathaniel Lyon. Lyon, who graduated West Point 11th in his class in 1841, was a veteran of the Seminole Wars and the Mexican-American War, where he had earned a reputation as a competent but ruthless officer. Stationed to this Northern California post in 1849, he had made it his mission to maintain order in the area. Within weeks of the murders, Lyon received orders to take his men north and to, quote, punish the guilty. They had moved out with adequate supplies for weeks in the field, and as they made the roughly 80-mile trek northwards, they also coordinated with local militias along the way and added to their already sizable forces. In the meantime, word had also spread amongst the Poma, and panic had set in amongst their ranks. Many among them actually denounced the murderers as having now condemned all of them to the punishments that were surely coming. Others were resolute in their desire to stand and fight the soldiers. It was ultimately decided that their best chance would be to congregate on the small island in Clear Lake known as Bonopotishi, roughly translated as small hill in the water. The island was surrounded by shallow water and indeed presented a location that would be easier to defend than hiding in the woods or in the open fields. At the same time, Lyon and his men had mustered and then made their march northwards. Pomo families began to gather on the island and stockpile supplies. Meanwhile, Lyon and his men had passed through Napa Valley and then crossed the Mayacamas Mountains before finally pouring into the Clear Lake Basin. Here, south of the lake, at a location known as Robinson Point, they had drawn up their final plan of attack. They would split their forces, with one side attacking from the north and the other attacking from the south, trapping the Pomo on the island. This contingent of soldiers to the south would be armed with 2 field cannons. ready and able to unleash artillery fire upon the Pomo. The field cannons, combined with the rifle fire of the soldiers attacking from the north, would unleash a volume of fire unlike anything the Pomo had seen before. With the plans in place, the men moved off in their respective directions and made ready for the next morning's attack. Just before sunrise, the men from the northern group of soldiers waded through the shallow waters and took their places amongst the tules. Then, just as the first Pomo had begun to stir from their sleep, the soldiers had unleashed their first volley of rifle fire into the village, indiscriminately firing into lodges full of men, women, and children. The initial volley had unleashed chaos, and now panic overtakes the island, with Pomo men attempting to arm themselves and fight back, and women and children attempting to escape in the shallows to the south of the island. But as they do this, the field cannons unleash their first volley of fire upon the island, cutting down several Pomo at once. Those remaining now flee to the western side of the island, the side nearest the mainland shore, where they are met by Lion's remaining men who pour more rifle fire onto the island. All of the Pomo have now collectively realized that they are not only trapped, but there is no effort being made to distinguish combatants from non-combatants. Horrified and enraged by this, warrior after warrior makes his final stand along the small island's shore, attempting to cover their families' retreats. One after another, the Pomo men are cut down. In many cases, so are their fleeing families. Some of the women and children make their escape by diving into the water and breathing through hollowed-out reeds. But many more are killed where they stand, with so many falling near the island's edge that the waters of the lake that surround it are now stained red with blood. A few of the Pomo are able to make it to the shore and to escape into the surrounding forest. Though they are able to skillfully meld into the landscape, many of them will soon perish of their wounds. Lion and his troops now seize control of the area and scour the island for surviving Pomo to take prisoner. But they find not a single survivor on the island. The Pomo, longtime inhabitants of this area, have now permanently lost their homelands. Within months, the area will be flooded with American settlers, and the indentured labor system that had already harshly impacted the Pomo would be redoubled. Tragically, they would never regain their lands again. For the Army's part, the soldiers involved in what has come to be known to history as the Bloody Island Massacre will face no retribution for their actions, and will simply return to garrison duty in the weeks to come. Captain Nathaniel Lyon will be praised by his superiors for his effectiveness in carrying out his duties. He will go on to continue his career in the Army, rising to the rank of Brigadier General in 1861. With the outbreak of the Civil War, Lyon served with distinction until August 10th of that year, when he would be killed in action at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, making him the first general to be killed in action during the war. Today, the massacre at Bloody Island is commemorated with a simple historical marker. The plaque sits on the location of the island, which is now part of the mainland due to shifting water lines. The marker lies just south of the town of Nice as a testament to one of the darkest and most little-known events in American history. But the many little-known stories that comprise the vast and complex history of the Old West are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Chapter 25. Crook's Fight on the Rosebud. Among the Cheyennes in this battle was Chief Cumsensight, a brave man and a good fighter. His sister had followed him out into the battle. At the beginning of the fight, he had charged the soldiers many times, and when they were fighting the upper group of soldiers, as he was riding up and down in front of the line, his horse was killed from underneath him. White Elk was also riding up and down the line, but was going in the opposite direction from Chief Cumsensight, and it was just after they had passed each other that Chief Cumsensight was dismounted. Suddenly, White Elk saw a person riding down from where the Indians were, towards the soldiers. He then passed Chief Comes-in-Sight. Then Chief Comes-in-Sight jumped on and rode behind him. This rider was the sister of Chief Comes-in-Sight, named Buffalo Calf Road Woman. The Cheyennes have always spoken of this battle by this name. In Cheyenne, it is Young Girl Saved Her Brother's Life. Coming-in-Sight is still living in Oklahoma, about 66 years old. It was near where Comes-in-Sight was unhorsed that the Shoshone with a spotted war bonnet was killed. White Elk expresses the opinion that in this fight there were perhaps 90 Cheyennes. He does not know how many Sioux may have been there. In the place where the hottest fighting occurred, there were more Indians than soldiers. But this does not count the troops that were on the other side of the stream, about 30 troops of cavalry. The account of what White Shield saw and did in this battle is interesting, because it gives so well the Indian point of view and explains to some extent the Cheyenne belief in the help received from animals. White Shield's name at that time was Young Blackbird. He is the son of Spotted Wolf, one of the bravest of the old-time warriors of the Cheyenne, who has been dead for about 20 years. Spotted Wolf, when he heard the news the soldiers were coming, said to White Shield, "My son, you had better tie up your horse. Do not let him fill himself on grass. If a horse's stomach is not full, he can run a long way. If his stomach is full, he soon gets tired. I wish to see you take the lead on this war trip." His father had been taught by the kingfisher bird and understood it. Spotted Wolf said further, "Son, go out and from one of the springs that come out of the hillside, get me some blue clay." After it had been brought to him, he painted on the shoulders and hips of the horse the figure of a kingfisher with its head toward the front. "Now," he said, "your horse will not get out of wind. Take him down to the stream and give him plenty of water, all he will drink." When White Shield brought the horse back, his father said, "When you are ready to start, I will go with you, and before you make the charge, I will put some medicine on you." Just before they left camp, Spotted Wolf said, "Now, drink plenty of water, and let this be your last drink until the fight is over." They started from camp after the sun was down and traveled all night, stopping only from time to time. At daylight, they were on the Rosebud at the mouth of Trail Creek. Above this they stopped and decided that as they were getting near to the enemy, they would dress and paint themselves here. His father dressed him, painting his whole body with a yellow earth paint. Spotted Wolf had a bundle containing the war clothing that he himself was accustomed to wear in fights. From this bundle he took a scalp, and placing the horse so that it faced toward the south, he tied the scalp to its lower jaw. He then put his own war shirt on White Shield, took his kingfisher, the stuffed skin of a kingfisher, and held it up to the sun and sang a song. "My son," he said, "this is the song sung to me when the spirits took pity on me. If the kingfisher dives into the water for a fish, he never misses his prey. Today, I wish you to do the same thing. You shall count the first coup in this fight." After he had finished speaking, he tied the kingfisher to his son's scalp lock. Held in the bill of the kingfisher were some kingfisher's feathers, which were dyed red. The feathers represented the flash of a gun. Then he hung about his son's neck a whistle made of the bone from an eagle's wing. He said, "If anyone runs up to you to shoot you, make this noise, and the bullet will not hurt you." He then took in his mouth a little medicine and a little earth, and raised the front forefoot of the horse, and blew a little of this on the sole of the hoof, and did the same thing on the right hind foot, the left hind foot, and the left forefoot. He then blew the medicine on the horse, between the ears, on the withers, at the end of the mane, and at the root of the tail. "Putting this on the soles of the hoof," said Spotted Wolf, "will make him carry himself lightly and not fall. When you come within sight of the enemy, when they are going to charge, put the whistle in your mouth and whistle. That is what the kingfisher does when he catches the fish. You shall catch one of the enemy. When you see the enemy, they may frighten you so that you will lose your mind a little, but I do not think that this will happen. You will frighten your enemies before they frighten you. I have fully dressed you for war. There are some women with the party. You must not ride by the side of any of them. Give me your quirt." He took the horse medicine and rubbed it all over the quirt, and said, "If you see any ahead of you and whirl your quirt above his head, the man's horse may fall. When you charge, try to keep on the right-hand side of everyone. Take pity on everyone. If you see some man in a hard place from which he cannot escape, help him if you can. If you yourself get in a bad place, do not get excited, but try to shoot and defend yourself. That is the way to become great. If you should be killed, the enemy, when they go back, will say that they fought a man who was very brave, and that they had a hard time to kill him." Such were the instructions given to White Shield by his father. Before this was finished, some of the Cheyennes had already gone forward, and a little later he heard shots, those fired by their own scouts who had met some of the Crow scouts. When the shots were heard, the Sioux and Cheyenne all charged, riding across the hills to where they had heard the shooting, running up one hill and down the other. They did not follow the stream valley. When they reached the place, the Indian scouts had retreated to the soldiers, who sat there on their horses. Old Red Warbonnet, Walks Last, Feathered Sun, White Shield, and White Bird were among the first to reach this point. The Sioux and Cheyennes were beginning to come toward the soldiers from all directions. At the top of the hill they stopped about 600 yards from the soldiers. Suddenly, to the right, a man appeared charging towards the soldiers. He was followed by a little boy, 12 or 13 years old. They recognized Chief Comes-in-Sight, and the boy was a little Sioux boy. The 5 Cheyennes who were mentioned charged, following the two, and about 50 yards behind them. Neither the soldiers nor the Indian scouts fired, but they kept moving about. When the Cheyennes were quite near to the soldiers, Chief Comes-in-Sight turned his horse to the left, and the boy went to the right. Chief Comes-in-Sight fired 2 shots from a pistol, and all of the soldiers shouted, fired, and charged. They began to overtake Chief Comes-in-Sight, who now joined the 5 Cheyennes, and all had to run. The Indian scouts chased the little boy and overtook him, taking from him his horse and killing him. As the 6 Cheyennes went back to the hill they had been on, the soldiers almost overtook them. When the soldiers were within 50 yards of them, Feathered Sun said, "Let us dismount. They are pushing us too closely." Feathered Sun and White Shield dismounted, and the troops stopped, all except one scout, thought to be a Crow. He carried a long lance, and, lying down on his horse's back so that he could not be seen, charged straight toward the 2. White Shield and the other man were some distance apart, and the Crow was coming straight for White Shield. He was obliged to shoot at the horse, aiming at its breast. When he fired, the horse turned a somersault, turning clear over. The Crow dropped his lance, and White Shield rushed to his own horse, and, as he mounted, it was like a wave of water coming over the hill behind him. The Cheyennes. They seemed to come from all of the foothills, and now the soldiers fell back. When the Cheyennes and Sioux charged down, they were less than 50 yards from the top. White Shield now turned his horse and rode along in front of the Indian scouts, who were all on foot and shooting. A little off to one side, the soldiers were fighting with the Cheyennes and Sioux. As he rode along, he saw a man who had been shot and was wearing a large war bonnet. The Cheyennes tried to count coup on the body, but the scouts fought for it. Here, a Sioux had his leg smashed, and a Cheyenne's horse was killed. White Shield got to within 3 or 4 yards of the body, but he was obliged to turn his horse. As he looked down, he saw a troop of cavalry galloping toward him, but not yet shooting. When they had come pretty near, the soldiers began to fire, and the Cheyennes and Sioux retreated to the hills. The Indian scouts and the soldiers made a strong charge and were right behind the Cheyennes and Sioux, who were forced to whip their horses on both sides to get away. It was a close race. The soldiers were shooting fast. Some men called out, "Stop, stop, the horses have been killed. Let us save these men and stand off the soldiers." They did not stop, but they succeeded in saving all of the dismounted men. The troops chased the Indians to a steep ravine which the horses could not cross. Those who reached it first dismounted. When they reached here, 2 more companies of soldiers came up. Before they came to the ravine, the charge dropped off a little, making a ridge behind which the Sioux and Cheyennes stopped, and all dismounted. This made them feel good, for here was something to fight behind. They were about 200 men strong. At this time, 3 separate fights were going on, of which this was the one in the middle. At this place, they shot down the horse of one of the scouts, and when his horse fell, the soldiers and scouts turned back, and the Cheyennes and Sioux mounted and charged them. They followed them back to the place where they had fought for the man with the war bonnet. On the way back, they overtook a scout on the wounded horse. He was a Shoshone. He threw himself off of his horse and ran ahead on foot. 2 Sioux were close behind him, and White Shield was off to one side. One Sioux carried a long lance, and as the Shoshone turned to fire, he struck him with the lance, and afterward, with the body of his horse, he knocked him down. As the Shoshone was getting up, the second Sioux ran him over with his horse, and then White Shield came up and shot him, but counted no coup. The soldiers and scouts charged back on them, and followed them back to the place where they had been before, at the edge of the ravine. All this time, the firing was heavy on both sides. When the Cheyennes and Sioux had run behind the ridge again, they stood with about half the body exposed, shooting over it. A Cheyenne standing by White Shield was shot through the body, but did not die until they got him to camp. For a long time, on a little flat 1/4 of a mile wide, they fought there, each side alternately retreating and advancing. Far off to the right they could hear shooting, which sounded as if it were going up into the hills. After a time, White Shield left this fight and rode off to one side to get into this other fight. When he rode his horse up on the hill, he could see the fight, one company of soldiers following up some Indians. The soldiers had left their horses and were advancing on foot. Their horses were 1/4 of a mile behind them. Riding up and down before the soldiers, he saw a young man whom he at length recognized as Goose Feather, a son of the chief Dull Knife. White Shield rode up until he met Goose Feather, who had gone behind a little knoll. Here he said to Goose Feather, "Hold my horse for a moment." He stepped over the hill in sight. As he did this, all the soldiers threw themselves on the ground and began firing, but he managed to jump behind a rock so as to be out of sight. Then the soldiers turned their guns and began to shoot in another direction at the Indians on the hill. White Shield now shot at the nearest soldier, who was about 40 yards off, but he shot under him, throwing the dirt all over his body. The soldiers now all rose to their feet to go back to their horses, and the nearest soldier, having partly turned, ran, and White Shield shot at him, and he fell. White Shield ran back to get his horse, but Goose Feather had let it go so that he might run down and count coup on the soldier. White Shield caught his horse, but Goose Feather reached the soldier first and counted coup on him with a lance, while White Shield counted the second coup with his whip. The third man to count coup took the soldier's arms and belt. The soldiers kept on running towards their horses. White Shield and Goose Feather now went on after the soldiers. Just as the soldiers reached their horses, an officer called out giving an order, and all the soldiers faced about to meet the charge of the great crowd of Cheyennes who were following. White Shield turned off to the right and got behind a little knoll. Every Cheyenne and Sioux dodged behind the knoll, and now both sides were shooting as hard as they could, only about 30 yards apart. All at once, the soldiers ceased firing, but the Indians kept on shooting. White Shield crept over the hill to look and see why the white soldiers had stopped. The horses were all in line, and the soldiers had one foot in the stirrup. Off to one side, a man was seated on a roan horse, who gave an order and then turned to look back. White Shield shot just as he turned his head, and when they found the man, He was shot just over the eyebrow. The soldiers started to retreat, and as they did so, they scattered. A man on foot, holding his horse with one hand and a six-shooter in the other, was trying to mount his horse. White Shield made a charge to count coup on him. The man shot at White Shield as he was coming up, but the horse pulled him, and he missed his aim. White Shield rode his horse between the man and the horse he was holding and knocked the man down with his gun. The next man behind White Shield rode over the soldier. White Shield turned his horse and rode back to the officer he had killed, and as he was going, he saw some guns. When he came back, the guns were gone, but the officer still had a six-shooter and a belt full of pistol cartridges. White Shield took the six-shooter. As he looked back, he saw the soldier that he had knocked down creeping about on his hands and knees and went back to kill him. He took his belt and cartridges, but his six-shooter was gone. At this place, White Shield stopped and got off his horse and led it up and down. At a distance, he could see the people fighting. The soldiers had separated and were split into twos and threes. Far off, he could see a great many soldiers and scouts. As he kept looking, presently he saw a person riding towards the soldiers, and then he saw his horse fall, catching the man under its body. He seemed to be trying to get out, but the scouts rode up and shot him. After the man was shot, all the Indians ran, and the soldiers followed them back to the place from which the Indians had driven the soldiers, and now the Indians had to scatter out by twos and threes. White Shield did not move from the place he was until the Indians got up to him. Then he mounted. Some of those who came up to him were riding double men whose horses had been shot or given out. Still, he waited, thinking he would have a chance to get in some more shots. He fired a shot or two, and then, looking down to one side, he saw a man on foot and soldiers following and overtaking him. When he tried to open his gun after firing, he could not open it. He had put in a captured cartridge, too small for the gun, and it had swelled and stuck in the chamber. Now, he was unarmed. By this time, the people had all passed, and the only man between him and the soldiers was the one on foot. He rode down to this man and found him almost exhausted. It was the young Two-Moon. White Shield called out to him, "My friend, come and get on behind me." The remainder of the Indians were a long way ahead of them. He said to Two-Moon, "I can no longer shoot. I have a shell fast in my gun." Many Indians ahead of them were now on foot, and many horses were constantly being shot and wounded or giving up and stopping. Here, Feathered Sun's horse was shot, and its rider jumped up and ran along on foot. The soldiers were close behind, only about 30 yards. Another man on foot was running along behind Feathered Sun, and just as he reached Feathered Sun's horse, which had been knocked down, it got up on its feet, and he jumped on it, and it ran off as well as ever. It had only been creased. Down the line, a man was seen coming, and when he got near, they could see it was Contrary Belly. He was leading a roan horse, and as he overtook them, he said, "Here is a horse for you to ride," and Two-Moon took it. As White Shield rode on, he saw in front of him a Sioux on horseback, and another Sioux on foot, carrying a stick in his hand. He rode up to the man on foot and saw that he was carrying a ramrod, for he had been using a muzzle loader, and with this ramrod, White Shield knocked the shell out of his gun. Meanwhile, the soldiers and Indian scouts behind them were seeing how much noise they could make with their guns and cries, and the Cheyennes and Sioux in front were running and stopping and firing. The Sioux on horseback had on a war bonnet and shield. As he rode, his horse's leg was broken. He would not leave his horse, but stopped to fight, and then turned and ran to some timber. The soldiers and scouts all seemed to follow him, and this gave the other Indians a chance to get away. The soldiers killed the Sioux, and then all turned back. The Cheyennes and Sioux watched them a long time from the hills, and then went to their camps. Eagle Pass, Texas, April 25, 1875. Private Pompey Factor wipes the sweat from his eyes, clearing his vision of the near-apocalyptic sight before him. Sweeping down upon his position are dozens of incensed Comanche warriors, all intent not only on killing Pompey Factor and his 3 fellow soldiers, but hoping to accomplish this grisly task via the long, drawn-out tortures they have become famous for across the frontier. Factor and his mates are well aware that the coming minutes will spell either their doom or their salvation, and that the former scenario is far more likely. Pompey Factor, Sergeant John Ward, and trumpeter Isaac Payne, all members of a mixed-race Black and Seminole contingent of scouts attached to the famed Buffalo Soldiers, are locked in a desperate battle with an exponentially larger attacking force of Comanche warriors. Despite the cultural and ethnic mix present on the battlefield, the U.S. Army has, 10 years after the completion of the Civil War, still not changed their requirement that officers in command of these units be white. Thus, in command on this day is Lieutenant John Latham Bullis. However, at this very moment, regardless of their personal backgrounds or the greater ramifications of United States federal policy, all 4 men are concerned solely with the immediate threat of the Comanche warriors now bearing down upon them. They are all experienced warriors. Lieutenant Bullis is a respected veteran of the Civil War, and not only have all these men spent the preceding year fighting the vicious Red River War, but these 3 scouts, Pompey Factor, John Ward, and Isaac Payne, have grown up in lives radically different from their cohorts serving in the Buffalo Soldiers. Following the abolition of slavery and the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War, the Army had formed 4 regiments of black soldiers, most of whom were former slaves. These regiments wasted no time in proving their skill and daring as they fought in campaigns against the Plains tribes, a conflict that had reignited with America's post-war revival of enthusiasm for westward expansion and for settlement. Though the origins of the term Buffalo Soldier are in fact highly contentious, one theory holds that the troopers were one of the few units outfitted with buffalo hide coats to combat the open plains winter chill, and the locally sourced and supplied buffalo coats presented a viable, affordable, and very effective solution to the Army's supply chain conundrums. Thus, oftentimes when a soldier from one of the newly formed regiments was seen for the first time by a Plains tribe warrior, he would be sporting one of the heavy, full-length buffalo coats. However, regardless of the origins of their name, the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers, even 9 years after their inception, is one of notable gallantry and exceptional courage in combat. Many, if not most, of the men in these regiments see their service as an opportunity to prove their merit and worth in a country that, though it had granted them their freedom, was still deeply divided amongst itself and in many instances openly hostile towards them. But many of them also see this as a chance at adventure, to see lands that they had never seen before, and combat an enemy that most had only heard of. However, this is not the case for their cohorts in what are known as the Seminole Scouts. Though they are indeed of shared racial background with their fellow Buffalo Soldiers, they are in fact part of a rich and storied heritage of escaped slaves who had assimilated into various tribes in the American Southeast. Most prominent among these were the mighty Seminole, themselves a tribe who owned and traded slaves, though they also fought Southern slavers seeking to recapture their escaped slaves. They also combated the U.S. government's attempts to take over their own homelands, and warred incessantly with their hated enemies, the Creek. In the wake of what would come to be known as the Trail of Tears, the Seminole, along with many other eastern tribes, were forcibly relocated to what is today the state of Oklahoma. This resulted not only in inhumane treatment from the United States government, but a whole new danger in attacks from tribes native to the area, most notably the Kiowa and the Comanche. After years of enduring the misery of their newly imposed locale, the sizable number of mixed-race Seminole, weary of racial tensions and poor treatment from virtually all of their new neighbors, migrated to northern Mexico at the invitation of the Mexican government. Though Mexico had abolished slavery in 1837 and could guarantee some kind of reprieve from the antebellum tensions of America in 1850, their motives were also, in large part, self-serving. Much as they had with the Texans nearly 2 decades earlier, the Mexican government intended to use the settlers on the border as fodder of sorts for the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache raids that had long terrorized the Mexican settlements to the north. Regardless, though they were no doubt aware of these problems to some degree, large numbers of Seminole moved south into the mountainous, rough-hewn borderlands that comprise northern Mexico. Here, for nearly 2 decades, they survived and even thrived in an entirely new and notoriously unforgiving environment while under relatively constant attack from the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Apache. One of the most experienced scouts, Pompey Factor, had been born in 1849, the son of an escaped slave and a mother who belonged to the Biloxi tribe. His family, too, had grown tired of the constant turmoil in the south and elected to move to northern Mexico. Though most of the southeastern tribes were staunch Baptists, many, Pompey Factor included, were Jesuit-educated and well-read. Following the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865 and the abolition of slavery, many of the mixed-race Seminole ventured back north of the Rio Grande, and many had enlisted as scouts for the U.S. Army in order to assist in tracking down their old foes in the Kiowa, the Apache, and the Comanche. They are required to furnish their own horses, and they are subject to the orders of the Army officers, but otherwise, they operate with an autonomy unheard of in the Army at this time, and adding to their mystique amongst their fellow soldiers, the Scouts also remain far more adherent to their Seminole culture than anything else. Though most of them wear the blue-jacketed uniform of their Buffalo Soldier cohorts, the Seminole Scouts also sport the trappings of their native forefathers in the forms of leggings, moccasins, necklaces, and in some cases, even headdresses. They are held in awe, even by the toughened and already legendary Buffalo Soldiers, as unmatched trackers and fighters, capable of traveling unheard-of distances on half rations, and doing so repeatedly, day after day, until ultimately tracking down their enemy and emerging victorious. During the previous year's Red River War, they had been used to great effect by Colonel Reynolds Slidell Mackenzie as he had pursued Quanah Parker and those amongst the Comanche in northern Texas who refused to acquiesce to being confined to reservations in Oklahoma. They had all served with distinction, including Lieutenant Bullis, who had bolstered his reputation with several instances of personal bravery and selflessness that had solidified his deep bond with his men. His relationship with his men is described as more familial than militaristic. It was said that every time a scout had a new child, the lieutenant would visit their camp and act in place of a presiding chief, examining the baby and exclaiming that the child would indeed go on to grow strong and brave. This familial bond is a requirement for men who work in such small teams and in such remote places. The typical job of the Scouts sees them in conditions such as the ones they have found themselves in today on the Rio Grande River on a far more frequent basis than any of their comrades in the conventional forces. Lieutenant Bullis, Sergeant John Ward, Private Pompey Factor, and Private Isaac Payne had all been in hot pursuit of this raiding party, with the intention of catching them as they attempted to move their stolen horses across the river. The soldiers had all dismounted and snuck to within roughly 75 yards of where the Comanche were now pushing their horses across the river. All experienced fighters and keen to take the offensive, they had begun firing upon the Comanche, keeping up a relatively steady onslaught for nearly 45 minutes. During these early iterations of the battle, the scouts managed to kill 3 Comanches and wound 1 more. At first, due to the rate of fire and the sheer ferocity of the attack, the Comanche believed there to be a much larger force attacking them. The scouts are armed with .45 caliber Sharps carbines, as are the vast majority of troopers assigned to serve with the Buffalo Soldiers. These rifles represent a new wave of battlefield technology that has drastically changed the dynamics of combat in the West in the little over a decade since its implementation. Combatants of 10 to 20 years prior were limited to single-shot muskets and rifles whose cumbersome loading processes and maintenance requirements rendered them a liability against foes who are mounted on horses and capable of firing several arrows a minute. Though the advent of the Colt revolver had indeed been a massive jump forward for the American forces in combating the Plains tribes, it is only in relatively recent times when the average soldier and scout could count on being equipped with both long gun and sidearms that are capable of rapid rates of fire. However, as is the course through much of history, this technology does not exist in a vacuum, as for decades now, warriors of the Plains tribes have been acquiring revolvers and repeating rifles of their own. In this case, here on the Pecos River, this party of Comanche are armed with several Winchester lever-action rifles. Once they are able to discern that the force attacking them is not a sizable contingent of infantrymen, but a small group of 4 scouts, they begin to lay down a withering field of fire with their own weapons. In one of these exchanges, roughly 30 minutes into the fight, Sergeant Ward's rifle stock is shattered by a Comanche bullet, and in short order, the Comanche mount an offensive charge. This charge is the one now bearing down upon Pompey Factor and the other scouts. The nearly instantaneous decision is made to retreat to their horses, to mount up, and to ride for their lives now that the tide of battle has turned against them so decidedly. This is commonplace in combat on the Texas frontier, as either side saw little merit in last stands that few, if any of their countrymen, would ever even hear about. Factor, Barnes, and Payne quickly mount up and, in a matter of mere seconds, are riding north towards the relative safety of the larger force of Buffalo Soldiers. Lieutenant Bullis's horse, however, refuses to allow Bullis into the saddle. Somewhere in the chaos of the fight thus far, Bullis has also incurred a gunshot wound to his lower right leg. Though it is a flesh wound, it renders him significantly less mobile than his men. His horse, driven into a frenzy by the chaos of the battle, now spins in tight circles and nips at the cavalry officer, who can only make repeated and increasingly desperate attempts to gain a seat in the saddle. With every revolution of the wild-eyed horse and every passing second, Factor, Ward, and Payne get further away from Lieutenant Bullis, and the attacking Comanche draw nearer. But within moments, the men agree they cannot leave Lieutenant Bullis to die at the hands of the Comanche. So, all 3 of them wheel their horses around and charge headlong towards an attacking force that outnumbers them roughly 8-1. The men reach Lieutenant Bullis only moments before they are surrounded by dozens of charging Comanche warriors. This chaotic scene only serves to further frighten Lieutenant Bullis's whirling and wide-eyed horse, who again and again rebuffs the officer's efforts to get one of his boots in the stirrups and hoist himself into the saddle. As the lieutenant continues his efforts in vain, Factor, Ward, and Payne empty their rifles into the oncoming warriors. And almost immediately after his first shot, Ward's rifle is shot again, the stock completely shattered and the firing mechanism rendered warped and useless. The fight quickly devolves into a hand-to-hand struggle, with Factor, Barnes, and Payne clubbing and stabbing any warrior who rides within striking range as they do their best to dodge incoming arrows and form a loose three-man perimeter around the still struggling lieutenant. Now, the men are again pinned down. Still, Sergeant Ward manages to make his way to Lieutenant Bullis while Factor and Payne fight off the remaining attackers, actually managing to drive the Comanche into a brief retreat. For the better part of 2 hours, the four men fight off charge after charge from the incensed and incessant Comanche warriors, who only become more and more intent on killing their adversaries as more and more of their comrades fall. Finally, sensing an abatement in the action that might be long enough to grant them escape, the men make a mad dash to the north, with Lieutenant Bullis riding behind Sergeant Barnes, leaving behind the errant, crazed horse. They head towards Fort Clark, nearly 60 miles away. For the better part of a day and a night, the men make their way to the fort, alternating between carrying the wounded Lieutenant Bullis behind them as they continue to scan the countryside around them in search of more Comanche assailants. Finally, all four men miraculously arrive at Fort Clark. Lieutenant Bullis credits his men with repeatedly and publicly, quote, saving my hair. Almost immediately upon their arrival at Fort Clark, Lieutenant Bullis files the necessary paperwork recommending all three enlisted scouts for the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest award for bravery. On May 28, 1875, Private Pompey Factor, Private Isaac Payne, and Sergeant John Ward are each awarded the Medal of Honor, making them 3 of 18 total men who served with the Buffalo Soldiers who would earn such a distinction. While there is no record as to the personal thoughts of the men upon being awarded their medals, the events of April 25, 1875, will go on to speak volumes in posterity. For his part, Lieutenant Bullis would continue his service in the Army until 1898, retiring at the rank of Brigadier General. After retiring, he would move to San Antonio, Texas, where he served as the U.S. Deputy Treasurer for the Federal Sub-Treasury in San Antonio, essentially the government's local banker. He would serve there until his death in 1911. However, sadly, there is little information on the lives of Factor, Payne, and Ward after their military service. Pompey Factor appears to have first moved to northern Mexico, where he farmed for a number of years before moving just north of the border to Brackettville, Texas, where he would pass away in 1928. He was buried in Brackettville at the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery. The details of Isaac Payne's life are even more sparse, stating only that he moved to northern Mexico, also took up farming, and passed away in 1904. He was first buried in northern Mexico, but his remains were later returned to Texas and interred at the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery in Brackettville. John Ward would go on to serve until 1894, totaling 24 years in the U.S. Army before retiring to Brackettville. Here, he would make his living as a farmer until passing away in 1911. Like his comrades, Ward is interred at the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery in Brackettville. But while these three men represent some of the most awarded soldiers of their regiment, their story is not the only one of grit, determination, and survival amongst their ranks. Nor is it the only tale of the Comanche fighting against all odds to hold on to their way of life. However, the countless tales from all sides of great service, sacrifice, violence, and vengeance are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. Also, be sure to follow us on TikTok and Instagram, and subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.